So I wanted to share some of the insights with you about where we are in terms of both privacy but other factors when it comes to building a web browser, to being a web browser vendor, but also some of the insights about what's happening on the web. And I think we're going through a sea change, and I don't think all of us are sort of appreciating that as much, I think, as we are at Brave. And I wanted to share some of the ideas about where we can go in the pretty near future. So I wanted to start by talking about some of the near-term goals and ideas we are focusing on, and a lot of these things are privacy related, as you heard from Pete just a few minutes ago, but not only. So for example, there are interesting benefits when it comes to performance that come out of fighting third-party tracking as well. But I don't want to dwell on that too much because many of you are probably familiar with a lot of these themes by now. What I wanted to focus the bulk of today's discussion on is something else, which is when it comes to consuming content online, we are seeing quite a sea change there. So the ability of content providers, the ability of publishers to get paid for their content has gone down quite drastically. And I'll talk about some of the factors, and I'm hoping to bring some of these ideas together and provide some insights around that for you. And so some questions emerge. So can we monetize things differently? So our idea, our approach is to use cryptocurrencies as a way to do content monetization. I'll show to you how this works. And secondly, well, advertising, right? There's a lot of negative sentiment towards advertising in some quarters, perhaps, but can we do it better? And so for many years, we've seen ideas around privacy-preserving advertising being published at conferences such as USENIX Security, CCS, and so forth, Oakland, that sort of thing. And we're trying to actually put this in production. I'll show you some examples of that, and you be the judge. And lastly, I wanted to focus on a few future steps, and I wanted to make 3 concrete proposals where browser vendors can bring their ingenuity and do fairly specific things to help the user, to do more for them as the user agent. Yeah? OK, so this is where we start. And this is a picture that many of you probably have seen, a variant of this picture many of you have seen if you have done any work on web tracking or web privacy, that sort of thing. This is a picture, in this case, that comes from an extension called Firefox, and a Firefox extension called Lightbeam. So what's showing is in the center of the picture, there is the website, the first party, such as like a news site to which the user is actually going. And then around that, you see all of these trackers that are sort of the third parties that are also participating, if you will, in this conversation. And the point here is that, well, we don't really, generally speaking, want them to be present. And this has been going on for a decade. And what I'd like to argue is that we are seeing a change here, and we are seeing some of the signs of this change, in part in Europe because of GDPR since May 2018, and there are some numbers starting to emerge about how the situation is starting to become slightly different. So specifically, the web is getting quite a bit cleaner, especially in Europe. But so why is this happening? Let's just remind ourselves why this is the case. This is because there's a need to build user models of user interests, behavior, and so forth, typically to do targeting for advertising. This is one of the most common uses of this. There's also personalization. And so as a result of this, over the last decade or so, and this is a graph that comes from a company over in Ireland called PageFair. So they've been tracking this for close to 10 years. We've seen users in bulk installing extensions. And I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, if I did a show of hands, I'm sure most of you would say, well, I've used some sort of an ad blocker in the past. Could be an extension, could be an ad blocking browser like Brave, could be something else also. But we see that both on desktop platforms as well as mobile platforms. Generally speaking, tons of users are blocking extensions. In some countries, this is really quite prevalent. For example, in Germany, other countries a little bit less so. But there is clearly a very strong trend here. And so, it's no secret that, as a result of this in the browser, we are doing this kind of blocking by default. So you can go and this is this metaphor of shields, right? So if your shields are up, then you're blocking not only, in fact, ads, but also tracking and fingerprinting and various other somewhat nefarious, shall we say, activities that might be happening on the website as well. So what else in the near term? Well, so we're working on improving ad blocking. And so Pete has already alluded to some of this. Some of this is driven by machine learning technologies. We have a few other things that he didn't talk about that we have in a couple of upcoming papers. So if you're interested in that, go to this website. I have at the bottom, brave.com/research, and you'll see some of the preprints about some of the recent works there as well. Now, something we actually are shipping, and this is, a little scary in so many ways, in that this is a technology that I think has never been shipped before, although, people have been talking about this academically for quite a number of years, as I said, is privacy-preserving advertising. So something in the browser that is able to construct accurate user models of user interest and so forth, and create matching between ads and user behavior on the client. So this is edge-based computing. This is another term for this as well. We also have a wallet, a cryptocurrency wallet that is sitting within the browser. And this is an idea that's been tried by other browser vendors as well. So for example, Opera quite recently, I think in the last 2-3 months, shipped a wallet for Ethereum, for ETH. And so, of course, the question is, well, how do you actually use this, right? So there's this inkling that, well, we should combine browsers and some form of value transfer, right? And we should make it so it's possible to pay people out there on the web. But I would argue that we don't quite know how to do that perfectly just yet. And I think these are some of the ideas that are just starting to emerge. There's a term for that, Web 3.0, but frankly, my position is that not too many people know quite what that is just yet. And last but not least, there's also quite a bit of focus on performance. So the nice side effect of the fact that you're blocking quite a lot of third-party advertising is that you're executing quite a lot faster. So we have a bunch of measurements focusing on latency, memory consumption, battery consumption, and a few other factors that show that, well, just as a result of that, as well as some other optimizations, the web runs faster. And while many of you in this room might be privacy advocates, or you might be more prone to notice things that are related to privacy, like an average person on the street, the first thing they notice when they're on Brave is that it just runs faster. They don't know why it is, they don't question it necessarily, but this is really quite a nice side effect. And frankly, I mean, it's very rare that you see a paper that says, well, this has these security benefits, and then things also run faster. Usually you think about protection in terms of the overhead it induces. It's really quite rare that you have performance and protection in the same package, if you will. So this is it. OK, so this is the near term. But I wanted to focus on trends, right, as I promised to you before. Let me point out some of them, and allow me to be negative here for just a few seconds. So online advertising, the way it's been done for the past, I don't know, decade, 12 years or so, is sort of collapsing. It's not working out just yet for most of the players. We had thousands upon thousands of third-party ad networks, I don't know, 5 or 7 years ago. Now that number has dwindled considerably. The publishing, online publishing, the way it's been done, is becoming a lot less profitable. And so I'll show you some signs of that as well. Difficult to make money. And then there are all sorts of privacy scandals. Some of them emerge from companies, near here, but others, so let's not kind of name names. My point here is bigger, in that big data often has undesirable privacy consequences, right? If you squirrel away tons and tons of data, it's fairly easy to lose it every once in a while. And then this last topic at the very bottom, which I sort of alluded to, and I said before, and I'll say it again, that, well, Web 3.0 is something that we're on the cusp of. And if you go to one of these blockchain conferences, people will talk about Web 3.0 without, I think, defining it properly. But anyhow, this is an interesting theme. How do we create a web of value in an environment where old mechanisms for creating value or capturing value are largely collapsing? So let me give you a very brief history. This is like 3 or 4 data points here and there. From the web, it was circa 1991. It was first created. This is, I think, the first page that was ever displayed in the web browser. And there's no advertising here. There's no money changing hands. It's all free, yeah? To the way it was circa, I don't know, 2011 or so. This is Dictionarycom, a website that's supposed to just let you look up, definition of words, yeah? But look at how polluted it is. Look at how it's like one ad on top of another, right? It's a complete mess. So part of the problem is that, well, what's called CTRs, click-through rates, are abysmally low as of now, and they have been getting lower and lower for many, many years, which is to say ads are genuinely not very profitable. I think about the amount of energy it takes, right? The amount of compute power it takes to create or to produce one of these ads and send them to the end user. It genuinely is very difficult to monetize these things. There is a whole bigger theory around it. If you're interested in this, read this book from Tim Wu, who is a professor at Columbia, I think, called The Attention Merchants. It really talks about this quite eloquently. But there is a point I wanted to make, well, several actually, but one of them is that, well, part of the advertising industry, online advertising industry that's profitable, has really consolidated to a couple of walled gardens. So these two companies over here on the slide are responsible for something 90%, over 90% of the advertising revenue. So there are a couple of walled gardens that are benefiting, and then others are sort of out of the picture. And large companies like Google, according to Princeton study, at the bottom, at the mentioned at the bottom, are present on some 70% of websites in their specific study, in their specific crawl. So publishing industry, what's going on there? I wanted to show you some headlines from last week alone. So this one is Huffington Post, layoffs happening there. This one is Condé Nast, which is one of the biggest publishers of those glossy magazines that you see at the dentist office. They're switching to a model that's subscription-based, so free access is no longer viable for them, the way it's been for the past, I don't know, 15 years or so. And here's another one, BuzzFeed, that didn't quite fit in the slide, also layoffs. So things are not really going well for these companies, are they? And this is just from last week. Actually, I think BuzzFeed was this week. So something else to add to this mix, which is GDPR. And GDPR came into effect in May 2018. It's been around for a few months. And maybe this is not quite enough to figure out what's happened since then, but we've seen a couple of papers. So there are 2 NDSS papers coming out fairly shortly, next month. And here are the preprints. So one of them, in fact, they call the unwanted sharing economy, looks at issues related to tracking and cookie sync and compares them in the US and Europe. And one of the takeaways here is that, well, the EU third-party tracking landscape is getting a lot cleaner, in part because of GDPR. So it's difficult to actually operate the same ad-based economy that's been around for about 12 years. It's become a lot more challenging. Okay, something else. So here's another NDSS paper called We Value Your Privacy, Now Take Some Cookies. And this is studying this issue of consent. And by that, they mean these cookie walls, right? These prompts that are in front of you that you need to click to get to the content you actually want to see. And so this is actually a very detailed study. They look at these types of banners by the country, by the region, and so on and so forth. But essentially, some of the takeaways here are what I have on the slide. So the user is effectively forced into accepting these cookies, accepting consent to be able to use the site. And really, it's not a model that's working particularly well, but this is sort of what we have. So the other thing is that, what you might expect to happen sort of does happen, right? Users get desensitized to these prompts, and they just click them blindly, right? So one of them says, well, is it okay to kill your grandma? They'll click on that with the same willingness they would on a proper consent kind of wall, right? So it's not great, right? It's sort of defeating the purpose of what this was designed for by EU lawmakers in the first place, I would argue. Here's another factor, which is actually one of our studies. This is some work we did at Brave. So we looked at some 1,000 top news sites worldwide, and also just Alexa 1,000, top 1K. And out of these, over 50% of these sites, of the news sites, that is to say, have some sort of a paywall. About 20% of top 1,000 sites overall have some form of a paywall as well. Paywalls, well, I'm sure you've seen these, right? This probably looks familiar to most of you. And you see these popping up at newspapers that then have one just like a few months ago. In Europe, this is pretty much omnipresent for popular newspapers, news magazines, that sort of thing. And, well, it's sort of a problem. It also points out that it's almost impossible now to operate the ad-based attention economy the way it's been operated for over a decade. So to summarize, we have a significant decline in terms of free content that's available out there on the web. We had a period of free and decentralized, I would argue, content creation from the birth of the web, from 1991 or so to maybe year 2000. And then after that, I would argue we had a reign of third parties. This is where we had tons and tons of these third-party ad networks being created, and they were making quite a lot of money. Now, I think, since about 2014, give or take, what we have is a reign of walled gardens. We have a few companies that are actually operating and making money and are doing quite well. But they've basically displaced this decentralized nature of the web that was there from the beginning. So the model of free content access that's sponsored by ads is no longer functioning. And even if you don't like ads, I mean, for a while, it was possible to access content without paying for it, which I would argue is probably not a bad thing. So the web now is a lot less free than it used to be just a few years ago, and free high-quality content is increasingly hard to find. So what can we do? We're trying to innovate here, and there are lots of challenges in the web it is today. So we are trying to pilot an idea of ads done differently. And this is what I was talking about before when I talked about privacy-preserving ads. And these are not ads that are embedded in pages. This is an example of one of these Brave ads for something called Hooch. So basically, this is an operating system notification that comes up at the bottom. And if you click on that, you'll go and get transferred to this page. This is an attempt to combine privacy goals with goals of transferring value in this ad ecosystem that I'll illustrate in just a second. And here's what it is, right? So we're trying to build a slightly different content monetization model. So you have the user at the top. And the idea here is really quite different. And this is important. The idea here is to reward users for their attention through ads. So if they choose to click on an ad and go and visit the web page, they'll be rewarded in the form of cryptocurrency called basic attention token that will be deposited in their wallet. And as a result, this is a fairly direct transfer of value that happens in the form of cryptocurrency in a way that was never possible or really nobody attempted before. Content creators, people who write interesting articles, people who publish blogs, they need to be paid for their efforts somehow. And this is what we're trying to create as a flow of value from users who are willing to compensate content creators. There are several ways to do that, and I'll illustrate that in just a second. And lastly, advertisers. So there's this whole gigantic issue of ad fraud. I don't really have the time to talk about that, but you can look at the numbers, and there are some estimates that say something like 50% of claimed impressions, ad impressions, are actually never seen by anybody, never seen by a human. A tremendous amount of ad fraud, and this is something we're trying to fight in this new ecosystem of ad delivery that we ourselves are designing. There are other ways to reward content creators. So here is something else from Brave as well. So there's this idea of tipping. So if you like somebody's content, if you like their website, blog, you can engage in a direct transfer of value. In many ways, this is, I think, what people allude to when they talk about Web 3.0. This is something that's possible if you have a wallet in the browser, the way I described, and if you basically have a way to engage in this much more direct transfer of value than we ever had before on the web. Now, think about this for a second. But now imagine Twitter monetized. Imagine a site like Twitter, where every like results in a tiny micropayment, every retweet results in a tiny micropayment, and so on and so forth. Right? So don't limit your imagination to sites that are simple like this one. Imagine something really complex where you can create much more interesting functions, much more interesting means of harnessing user attention and transferring value a lot more directly than we have today. So what else can we do for the user? let me leave you with 3 specific ideas that go beyond what we are doing currently. Because currently we are doing a few things, right? We are protecting the user, things like malware blocking. That's all wonderful, but we've been doing this for years. User rewards, this is what I talked about just now. So re-enable content access by paying user for their attention through ads, and then allow them to redeem the currency they have, the cryptocurrency they have, for pay-as-you-go consumption. So imagine if they were able to get through those paywalls by paying for things per article, right? Just for what they read, as opposed to getting subscriptions. That would essentially allow them to regain access they just lost in the last 2 years because of paywalls. I want to talk about 3 specific ideas on how we can help users. So here are some modest proposals, if you will. So the first one is about consent management. So I talked about this issue of consent, those prompts that you need to click on. So what if the browser were to help users decide which ones to say OK to and which ones are not so safe? What if the browser were to keep track of the consent decisions that you made and allow the user to also revoke consent if they had second thoughts? Number 1. Number 2, privacy policies, right? So just about every major news site or every major site you go to has some sort of a privacy policy, but nobody really bothers to read them. What if the browser alerted you to privacy policies that, on the basis of automatic analysis, it determined were not safe or just were undesirable, what have you? That would be really quite nice. Last one. Content subscriptions, right? So I talked about the issue of paywalls. What if the browser helped users negotiate content pricing? That really would be quite magical. This is where I wanted to stop. So just to summarize, the web is changing. We're moving from an ad-supported web to a web of value. Access to content is being taken away from us quite rapidly because of various forces such as GDPR, low click-through rates, and paywalls. We, as browser vendors, I think, here need to help the user in terms of making a transition from Web 2.0 to what is coming, Web 3.0. We're building a new system for content monetization, and I think the user agent needs to do a little bit more for the user. Thank you.